Good afternoon. My name is Itai Brun. I'm Deputy Director of the INSS, and this is an INSS conference dealing with the question how Israel can beat the coronavirus. This is our fourth conference in our coronavirus series. We talked about the implications on national security. We talked about fake news in the era of corona. We talked about the world after corona. Today we're talking about Israel, and next Monday at 1 o'clock we're going to talk about the impact the coronavirus will have on our regional system, the Middle East. In this conference, we're going to discuss the right strategy Israel should adopt in order to beat the corona and how to balance between the needs of the public health, economic needs, social needs, and other needs. And this is based on the work we did in collaboration with the Oron Institute to find out what's the right strategy. So let's start with you, the Director of the INSS, Major General in Reserves, Amos Yadlin. What does the INSS have to do with the coronavirus, and how did you come up with this idea of the INSS strategy for the coronavirus? Good afternoon, everyone, all those who are watching us live. The INSS deals with crises on the national strategic level. We think that this coronavirus crisis is not merely a healthcare crisis. It has much broader aspects: social, economic, security aspects. So far, we hadn't experienced any security problems during the coronavirus crisis, and it is our impression that at the beginning of the crisis, some very good measures were taken, but we also learned that usually they think about these measures, about these actions taken between the different press conferences from one night to the next, and there is no strategic thought to devote it how long we're going to remain in this event, in this lockdown, and there's a very heavy price. And our colleagues from the Oron Institute and our own economists calculated that we're talking about 40 billion shekels a month. There are over 1 million people today in Israel who are either unemployed or on leave without pay. Small businesses are being shut down. Businesses are being shut down. Everybody's only looking at the number of people who have become ill. And this is why we've decided to study this subject. We are not experts on medicine. We have brought various experts from the field of medicine to the Institute, and also many experts from the field of the economy. We have people who know about economics, people know about society, and we have an excellent team that knows about strategy. Itai Brun has already introduced himself. Udi Dekel, the Managing Director of the INSS. He's the former head of the Strategic Planning Division and the Planning Director of the General Staff. Assaf Orion, who also held the same position. And we said that we are identifying a national gap, and we need to bridge that gap, because if we keep this up, we're going to crash both economically and also on the healthcare perspective as well. Thank you very much, Amos. Like I said, the INSS has decided to exercise the strategic planning methodology as is used by various organizations. Now I'd like to ask you, Brigadier General in Reserves, Assaf Orion, who's from the INSS today. I'd like to ask you, what is this strategic problem, and what is Israel's strategic purpose, strategic directive in combating coronavirus? Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like everyone to see my presentation as well. The strategic problem, the way we understand it, is that we are experiencing a serious comprehensive crisis on various levels: health, government, social, economic, that's managed on a very unreliable database. We can only see the tip of the iceberg, only a very partial picture, and there is great uncertainty regarding the characteristics of this virus, the characteristics of the pandemic. Will there be mutations or not? Because of issues of discipline and time lag, and the decision making based on the current data, it's like driving a car while looking at the rear view mirror. The assumption that we need to make is that the virus will remain with us for quite some time and will return either in waves or in breaking waves, which are very high waves. And the current strategy that perhaps was correct for now was about comprehensive social distancing, and it had a very high economic cost, and it caused a lot of damage to the economy and society. And you know that it will be very difficult to recover from it as well. We also need to prepare to various changes, twists and turns. There could be some local or sectarial outbreaks in various blind spots that currently we cannot see, and various extreme scenarios such as an outbreak in Gaza or Judea Samaria. And some people would say that's not even a twist or a turn, that's even a very reasonable, plausible development. And so we said this is the problem. Now what is the purpose? The purpose is, now let's move on to the next slide, economic, health, and rapid economic and social and health recovery while avoiding very high costs such as a mass mortality, the collapse of the healthcare system, the collapse of the Israeli economy, undermining the Israeli regime's legitimacy. And we believe that along with the costs, there are opportunities here as well. And we could maybe utilize our protect our relative advantage, Israel's relative advantage. What we are suggesting is transitioning from a comprehensive, the current policy, which is a comprehensive medical healthcare policy, to a healthcare and economic policy, which is distinct and differentiated. We understand that not everybody is at the same risk level, either to be infected with the disease or to become a severe case. And also, the response of the economy isn't equal across the board. Therefore, we think that we need to renew the activities of the Israeli economy and, of course, not overwhelming the healthcare system and its respiratory and inhalator capacity. So what we are suggesting diverse efforts. The first one is limiting restrictive policy in protecting the high-risk population for becoming severely ill, to increase limitations on areas where it spreads rapidly, the illness, carriers or areas where there are many cases. That's the protective effort. A more lenient approach towards populations that the risk that they have for severe illness is lower. We believe that the leniencies should also be prioritized according to how beneficial they are to society. We don't want things to spin out of control. We think that we should provide proper medical response to some kind of gradual easement. And of course, we must expand our intel picture testing, virological and serological testing, and broad questionnaires given over a lengthy period of time. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Assaf. Assaf just presented the problem and the purpose, what we're trying to achieve, and the ID. And these can be carried out by various alternatives. So Udi, Brigadier General in Reserves Udi Dekel, the Managing Director of the INSS, former head of the Strategic Planning Division in the Planning Directorate of the General Staff. What are the stages in this campaign, and what are the different alternatives to achieving the goal? As we know, we are at the containment and mitigation stage, and in order to move on to the next stages, we need to be sure that we've managed to control the spread of this pandemic, and we can learn this from lessons learned other ways in the world. There's a certain, safety gap between the current situation and the curve. If we look at the ability of the healthcare system dealing with people who require life support, the issue of testing still is not at an adequate and satisfactory scope. We'll talk about that later probably. And also to be able to act quickly, to know that we have data, that the data is in real time so that we can draw conclusions and take action. And when you decide, even if you decide to do a lockdown on a specific problematic place, you need to make sure that it is effective, and the issue of educating the public. And we'll talk about that later as well. I'd like to talk about three options, alternatives, approaches. Let's look at this slide. Various measures of easing the restrictions. After we pass the containment stage, we need to start opening up. And there are certain measures. There is an approach that provides a health differentiation that, of course, attributes significant weight to the health aspect, but to try and reduce the economic damage to a minimum, to the necessary minimum. And even from this perspective, you can already identify population groups that are not high-risk populations, that they can be sent out to resume their work. For example, people at the ages of 20 to 44 who are a significant part of the contribution to the Israeli economy and its growth, and they are less threatened to become severely ill by coronavirus. And of course, all these things need to be accompanied by a system, a very rapid and effective testing system. That's one approach. The second approach that we're talking about, that's in the next slide, is an economic differentiation. And we say that the main thing should be, shifting the emphasis towards the economy. We need to take certain risks, even health risks, and to maybe risk some spread of the virus, but with the ability to control that curve that we constantly keep hearing about in the media. And according to this approach, we would like to mark certain sectors, facilities, businesses that are essential for the Israeli economy's growth, and to tailor the appropriate alternatives for the people who work in these sectors so that these people can be permitted to go to work. And of course, to make sure that the people around them and their environment is safe as well. Well, there are several approaches in this area that make a differentiation, and we can use these approaches in order to gradually ease up, let people out, and of course to constantly be on top of things and test and to know how to correct if we see that we're beyond the bounds that we've set for ourselves to be able to correct. So I've mentioned the ages. There's the younger age group that are a low-risk population group, and maybe some of them are already immunized. We need to check that as well. Another point is to create different work patterns. For example, to work in shifts and rounds. If you remember, in the military, we would remain in the military base for 10 days and 4 days at home. Maybe here we need to do the opposite. People will go to work for 4 days and then stay at home for 10 days. There are very interesting studies that show that the risk level of infecting others goes down to below 1 in such a scenario. We can also make geographic differentiation to look at certain geographic areas that are less dangerous and to be more lenient there, to let more people out there. There are places today that are more problematic where the population density is pretty high. We heard a lot about the town of Bnei Brak recently, but there are other places such as Migdal HaEmek, Yehud, Elad, Modi'in Eilit, Beit Shemesh, and so perhaps there we won't ease up that much, but there are other places where the confidence, the safety level is much higher. The key idea is to apply these criteria every time in every place, and that will enable more people to return to their work and set the wheels of the economy into motion, so to speak. The third alternative looks a bit further into the future, looks into the next stage, and that's life with the coronavirus. Here we're also talking about differentiation, but looking at other aspects, not just the economy, because we've perhaps neglected the society in Israel. Of course, we need to truly appreciate people's behavior, and people are getting used to these changes very quickly. But also we need to open up the social activities, schools, for example, a dynamic and differential shutdown. And of course, we need to have the proper testing that supports that. We are working in a method, or we will work in a method we learned in the military, learning by friction. If we see that the pace of the disease is accelerating in certain places, we'll have to stop there. I'm not going to get into all the components of this approach, but according to this approach, approach, we can open up even more groups to not, ordinary routine life. It's not going to be the life we used to, but living with the coronavirus with different rules regarding behavior in the public sphere. And that's the next stage, and we need to start thinking about it and planning for it already now. Thank you. Thank you, Udi. So we've seen the concept and the purpose. Udi presented the stages and several alternatives through which this objective could be executed. Now I'd like to ask you, Professor Amnon Shashua, the CEO of Mobileye, Professor of Computer Science. You've been researching this over the past few weeks. We'd like to hear your approach, your alternative that is based on a research that you've conducted over the past few weeks. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, so the actual alternative, it's not rocket science, and it's not even that original. It's more the mathematical analysis of this alternative, and I think that that's the interesting part. Because today we are at a lockdown that's horizontal, and then we switch to a vertical lockdown. At a vertical lockdown, we can decide on a lockdown that's geographically based or based on surgical accuracy, and that's the prevalent opinion today, to use various tracking and monitoring measures to find the people who are sick at the earliest stages of their disease by monitoring and tracking and seeing who were the people next to them, and thus to control the the curve of the spread of the disease over time. I have nothing against the alternatives, but we did examine another alternative. As we look at selection that's risk-based, we divide up the population into two groups, low risk and high risk. And high risk is not just age, it's people with various pre-existing health conditions. We know that the age is a dominant factor in mortality, but when we look at the severe cases who also need a life support, it's not just age. The age distribution is pretty uniform. Actually, a lot of people, young people, also need the ventilators, life support. The question is who has existing preconditions and who doesn't. So when we look at the capacity of the healthcare system, the existing preconditions are even a more dominant factor than age. When we talk about mortality, it's age. So we divided up the population into these two groups. The scientific question we asked, if we allow the low-risk population to leave the shutdown, not to be quarantined, in order to reach herd immunity, can the healthcare system withstand this? Will it not be overwhelmed? We're talking about the number of people in the medical staff and the life support systems. Will it not be overwhelmed if we let 6 million people out? There are about 1 million people who are over the age of 65, about 600,000 who have pre-existing conditions. So we're talking approximately about 6 million people, and we allow, let's say, everybody out without any restrictions. How will that impact the capacity of the healthcare system? And then the idea is that they will reach herd immunity, and then when we can let the high-risk population go out, they will be released into a population that's already immunized. And then what we get is two things. It's not about finding a balance point between the economy and health. We get both the economy and health, and it's important for me to explain this point. The economic aspect is clear. I mean, we let the people who are part of the low-risk population, they can go back to work, and then the economy functions again. I don't need to explain that too much. But as for the healthcare issue and mortality, and according to all the other methods, the spread of the disease, even if it's slow because we keep flattening the curve, it is, uniform across the population, whether it's low risk and high risk. And the high-risk population, their mortality, the fatality rates are much higher. But in this alternative, as we separate between the two population groups, the high-risk population is quarantined, it's isolated. The low-risk population reaches herd immunity, and then they can protect the high-risk population. So overall mortality will be lower than in comparison to other methods. So, the optimization and not to find a balancing point, a tipping point between the economy and the health, because this is good both for the economy and health-wise. So, okay, let's say we let the low-risk population population return to work, will it not overwhelm the healthcare system? I come from computer science. Why computer science? And I think here there's one important point. This virus, there's much unknown about it. We don't know much about how it is transmitted, how it spreads, the transmission rates. There are so many unknowns about this virus. So it's very difficult to create exact models. You know, computer scientists, the basics of computer science is called bounds. You take these variables you don't have any information about, and then you take the worst case scenario. You assume the worst. And then you use concentration meters in order to place the bounds. If you have an equation and you don't know what the variables are, and you look for the upper bound if it's the numerator, and the lower bound if it's the denominator. And this is what we did here. You need several parameters for that. One is, what is the percentage of carriers among the low-risk population? Currently, we do not have this information. We can try and guess, but it doesn't exist. Our calculations show that if we take a sample, a random sample of 5,000 people, it's very important for the sample to be random. Current samples are not random. If we take 5,000 people who are a low-risk population, we can know what is the percentage of carriers amongst the low-risk population. Another parameter we need to include into these bounds is among the group of people on life support. So far, until a few days ago, we had 74 people who needed ventilators. How many of them belong to the low-risk group? We don't have this information, but we did send representatives to all the hospitals in Israel 3 days ago, and we got this information. So until 3 days ago, the number of people who were on ventilators from the low-risk group, the number was 15 out of 74 on life support. So if we include that number and the percentage of carriers, our assumption right now that the percentage of carriers from a week ago was 2%. You know, it's kind of witchcraft because we don't really have a sample. I think that 2% is the lower bound, especially if we take Bnei Brak, for example, where I recently read that 50% of the population are carriers. So if the number you punch in is 2%, and you know, the higher the rate, the better the outcome. And if you take 2% and the number 15, which are people on ventilators, the upper bound for the number of the ventilators we need in order to send 6 million or 7 million people outside is 1,200. The state of Israel has 600 critical beds, so the transition from 600 to 1,200, this is something that we can cope with. I heard that Israel is preparing for 5,000, so 1,200, that's definitely a number that Israel can cope with. So, to recap, first of all, we need to have a random sample in order to know what's the percentage of carriers and then to put it into the equations. I think that the exact number will give us a bound that the state of Israel can prepare for. And then the state of Israel can let the low-risk population out at whatever pace it wants to. According to our model, it can tell everybody to go out without any restrictions, but there are different theories about viral loads. You can Google it. These are thesis. None of it is proven. It's been proven with other viruses, but it hasn't been proven with the coronavirus yet. So if you're exposed to the virus, you know, to an overload, if you're infected by a lot of people around you, then the chances for you to be severely ill, the chances are higher. So we don't want to take this risk of a viral overload. So we can tell people who are low risk to go out, but to give them instructions regarding social distancing. But what we learn from this is that we can manage the process. We can introduce measurable parameters into these equations, and at any given moment, you can manage the process. Professor Shashua, could you maybe explain why your approach, and it's what we're looking for, because it's good for the health and it's good for the economy. You don't need a trade-off between the two. What's the obstacle? How come we're not implementing this as a national policy? Well, there is no obstacle. It's just that these things, you know, kind of proceeded so quickly. We only started to work on this paper a week ago. We finished writing it within a day and a half, and then we sent it to rapid peer review. We posted it on a very large public platform, and we received all kinds of shortages from scientists from all over the world. There were different problems and loopholes. We corrected them. Now it's undergoing its third revision, the paper. 2 days ago, we gave a talk to 300 scientists in MIT. You could already find this paper on the MIT website. They've hosted it. I'm in contact with people in the government in India. They really liked this paper. As you can understand, a horizontal lockdown in India, it's even more problematic than a horizontal lockdown in Bnei Brak. I'm also in contact with people from the government in Argentina, New York, think tanks in Switzerland. But what about, government officials from Jerusalem? It just started a week ago. Let's give them time. I'm, not being critical at all towards anyone. I think that this model can serve as a useful tool, and I'm willing to talk about it to whomever is willing to listen. Okay, thank you very much. And now I'd like to move on to talk about the challenge of public health with several physicians, doctors who are here with us. We'll talk about transmission rate, risk populations, and the importance of testing. The first person we'll talk with is Dr. Ofir Cohen-Marom, Major General in Reserves. Colonel in Reserves, excuse me. Yes. Good afternoon. You started out by presenting this unique situation, which is indeed unique. We can analyze it from different angles. The perspective I'm going to present is based on a team of experts from different medical disciplines, and it is based on mathematical models. We won't get into them here, but I can tell you that some of them are pretty similar to the ones just discussed by Professor Shashua just now. It's very important to say from the outset that the measures that we've taken so far have succeeded. The quarantining of the population has succeeded. The number of people who need ventilators, the number of severe cases is not that high, so that's good. It means that all in all, situation is under control right now, but there's the heavy implication on all the other resources, and we need to prepare to ease up on the lockdown since there is no vaccine. I mean, if there were a vaccine, things would be much simpler. Therefore, we need to prepare some kind of a herd vaccine in under such uncertain terms. In order to develop that, we need approximately 80% of the population to be immunized before we can let everybody out. And of course, we need to expose the population gradually. If we know that we can monitor different populations, those who take proper protection is safe, but many of them have not done so. Therefore, they are not immunized. We're talking about a population. If they are indeed immune, you can expose them without a problem to other corona patients, and that is also relevant to essential services such as banks, the electricity corporation. It's very easy to know who is immune, who isn't, and then to choose who can be initially exposed. Beyond these population groups, we also need to look at which populations can serve the rehabilitation of the economy. For example, the high-tech population. That's a classic population, a young, healthy population that even if it is exposed, most of them are probably already exposed from what we know, but even if it is exposed, most of them will be asymptomatic. Large facilities, large plants with a lot of young employees, once we send them outside in a controlled manner while all the other population groups are still in quarantine, that enables them to develop immunity in a controlled manner. And then even if some of them do need to go to hospital for some reason or another, it's still the healthcare system won't be overwhelmed. It will be within capacity. The next group is the general population that we can send them out based on their geographic location. Professor Shashua talked about the fact that we need to know how many people are immunized. We will start a study next week with 5,000 people from the military, and we will know from this study out of this group how many have been exposed to the virus. That's different from the testing currently held, that the purpose is detecting the virus. We're going to look look for these proteins, these immunoglobulins that identify who's already immune in the society. If we know who's already immunized within the population, whether it's civilians or military personnel, not only can we send them back to the workforce, we can even expose them to the population which is allegedly sick. And in this matter, even if we later release later on, and of course the last ones we'll let outside are the older population and people with pre-existing conditions. But once they are sent out, they will be sent out and meet people who are already immunized. And the testing we have today are pretty credible. We have heard over the past few days that there are kits, these rapid testing kits, most of them Chinese, and they've arrived recently, but they do not deliver. We suggest not to rely on these kits, but in the different universities, university labs, we have the kits that we know that are reliable. By using that, we can map the population in Israel so that we can be prepared to let people outside in this wave. But even if we see a second wave, as we can see in other countries, we know that we'll start these waves on in a much better position. Thank you very much, Ofir. Now let's move on to Professor Gili Regev-Yochay, Director of the Infectious Disease Epidemiology Unit at the Sheba Hospital. And now I'd like to read, before you start talking, a few questions that people posted on our Facebook page. Do we have exact and accurate data on the locations of the outbreaks? Which measures are being taken in order to immunize? How many people are supposed to die for herd immunity? And how long does it take until herd immunity becomes effective? Professor Regev-Yochay, please. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say a few words about the tests first, because then we can go to all other directions. What we definitely need now is the serological testing. We're working on it. I know that the National Institute is working on it. There are a lot of places that are trying to reach these good serological tests. I'm not familiar with anything we can start even using next week. Once we have that, and in large quantities, that will put us in a very different place. Let me tell you that currently, even the regular tests, the PCR, there's a certain limitation. I was informed today that we have only tests for the next 3 days. We don't have enough reagents. What are these reagents? Could you maybe explain? These are the materials that are used for the testing. You know, we have the instruments, we have the people, but we don't have the materials, the substances. These need to come from abroad, so we don't have these substances, and this is why we cannot perform the testing. If we cannot perform the testing, everything that's been said here is purely theoretical, and that would put us at a very different place, and that's pretty disastrous. What do we need to do in order to have these substances? That's an excellent question. I don't know what the answer is. This truly concerns me. I really lose sleep over this because we have no way to progress, and there's going to be a major outbreak here. And before I answer some of the other questions regarding Professor Shashua's very interesting idea, we need to be very careful. I mean, the risk in sending people out like that could be very big, because if we're talking about young people, we cannot separate between young people who are 20-year-old and in their 20s and come to visit their parents who are in their 50s. I'm not talking about, the elderly people who are in old age home, people that you can, concentrate in one place, because our populations are very mixed. The high-risk populations, oncological patients, they're not, separated from the rest of the population. Once everybody's sent out, it's very risky. I do believe that we need, to lift this lockdown. It's not a good solution over time, but to just let out the healthy populations. And by the way, the British, they've tried that. They said, let's try and do that, but it didn't work. We have to first of all start with informing the public, educating the public, talking about social distancing as part of life. People need to learn how to stand in line in the supermarket like the people in Singapore. In the Czech Republic, people there put a mask on their face. Whenever they leave their home, they put a mask on. It can be very simple mask. You don't need anything sophisticated. and to keep 2 meters. Yes, 2 meters from each other, and they know to constantly disinfect their hands, and because gloves can be dangerous as well. You need to know exactly what to do. It will be a very strange life for all of us, but we need to simply do that because people need to start to resume their lives. And it's true that we need to start with the young and the healthy, but we can't just let everybody out because that would be disastrous. And that's, by the way, what's happening in Bnei Brak. And I'm certain that they're protecting the elderly there, but still, look at the outbreak there. And we can see it in my hospital at Tel HaShomer. Almost all the people who come to us are from the town of Bnei Brak. Okay, now that takes us to the first question, to the outbreak locations. These are pretty well known. We have a map indicating the morbidity rate in every town, how many cases in every town in comparison to the size of the population. We're trying to work with it and to keep up to date and to see which areas are more endemic, as we call them. And many of these places are where the ultra-Orthodox Jews live. Regarding the Arab sector, we don't know that much. We don't have enough data. Populations that are densely populated, they are more vulnerable. That's obvious. And there are other questions. Do they go to synagogue? Can they convene? These issues, that's very difficult to explain because the behavioral change required is a major one. A few words about immunity, herd immunity, and actual immunity or vaccine. Well, an actual vaccine that will definitely change the face of this pandemic. Once we have that, things will completely change. In a fantastic world, it'll take at least a year to find a vaccine, probably even 18 months, and that means we're in for a difficult winter next year because then we'll also have the flu and other things. As for herd immunity, right now, you can calculate it, the required immunity according to the R0. If it's 2, we're talking about 50% who need to be immune for the pandemic to end. If the R0 is 4, as some people claim, we're talking about 75% of the population. It really depends on where we're standing, and we're talking about a very high rate of herd immunity for that to happen. Maybe we'll reach that more quickly in the town of Bnei Brak, but in Tel Aviv or Rehovot, it will take longer. So that's that. What about the other questions? Let me just see if there was anything else I wrote down. Another thing that's important to bear in mind, and it didn't come up, it's important to remember, it's not that we've stopped today. There is still a constant increase. It's true that the increase is less exponential, but we still see an increase. It's important to take that into account. Even if things remain as they are today, we will see multipliers. We will have an increase. So we need to let people out, but to do so very cautiously and to really teach people what they need to do. Thank you very much, Professor Regev-Yochay. Now we'd like to speak with you, Professor Shlomo Segev, an infectious disease specialist from the same hospital, the Sheba hospital. Yes, hello, my name is Shlomo Segev. Good evening. Wow, Gili, I was sure that there were a lot of tests on their way, and now you told me that there aren't that many. That saddens me. I'm in favor of multiple testing. We don't need serological testing at this stage. We can remain with the PCR because the serology will present a much clearer situation in the future in comparison to now, because, the more people who are ill will see that in the serology later on. And let me also say and comment that I think that our people are disciplined, the people of Israel. If people were, if simply they had been leveled with at the outset, I think we need to teach people a new form of behavior. Now I'd like to talk only about the healthy population. First of all, I'd like to talk about the elderly, that, their mental state, their emotional state is deteriorating. We need to give them support. We need to find a way to reach them. I mean, their family members, their loved ones should be allowed to come and visit them. We can do multiple testing in nursing homes, and there is also something proposed by the Weizmann Institute by Professor Adi Shamir, multiple testing for institutions. I think that their family members and their loved ones should undergo serological testing, and in a while we will see people who are immune, and then they can go to these places. That's one group. Regarding the rest of the population, I think that the Kupot Cholim, the HMOs, we aren't hearing about them. They have tremendous power. They can reach their people, their population, and if tomorrow we start testing en masse, we will find the carriers, we will quarantine them. And now I'd like to talk about this concept of shelter in place. I haven't heard about that before this pandemic. This understanding that if somebody is a carrier, all the people around him need to be sheltered in place for 2 weeks. And if you multiply the number of people who are sheltered in place, the situation is very bad. But if you were to check those people, what percentage of them are truly ill? If you could take the people who need to be quarantined and to give them PCR tests, maybe you can shorten the period of time, maybe to send them outside. I like your idea, Amnon. It's a bit scary, and I understand why you are scared of it, Gili. Still, I believe that there are a lot of healthy people who do not pose a threat. And therefore, I think that this mass testing, just like everybody keeps saying testing, it all depends on that. And if we add to that the idea of Professor Eran Segal from the Weizmann Institute, I don't know if you've heard about it, a very intelligent clinical questionnaire that enabled them to predict the pandemic in Bnei Brak in Jerusalem a week before with only 150,000 people. I think that last time I spoke with them, they already had 300,000 people who answered the questionnaire. So the combination of all these things and the fact that we can be tracked and monitored, then that'll give us much more accurate information than the 5,000 suggested by Amnon. And I think it all depends on this information. Once we know, I think we can deal with it in a much more intelligent way. I still think that we need to let young people go back to work, and I think that this is what we needed to do. Well, before we finish the medical panel, somebody wrote another question. What do we know about the recurrence of the disease among those who have recovered? Is there any data about that from China or from anywhere else in the world? As far as I know, then the answer is no, we don't know. I don't think that there's any proof of that. We don't know if this disease recurs, and this is why we've drawn our conclusion. Maybe it's not 100% sure, is that those who have antibodies, the IgG is immunized. It's not certain that it's true, even though it seems reasonable, and it's not sure for how long. With the flu, you need to renew your vaccine every year. So this issue of recurring waves or these terrible projections by the Director General of the Ministry of Health that a lot of people will die here over the next winter. I think that by then, I'm an optimist. I think that by then we will have drugs or cures. I don't think that there will be a vaccine. I agree with Gili that you need at least 18 months for a vaccine. Professor Regev-Yochay, would you like to comment on this question? Let me just add that I agree with Shlomo 100% on that. I think that the indication right now is that once you recover, you're immune. Does that last for one season only or for more? We still don't know. But I think that in this season we need additional tests and probes. But right now the indications show that this is the case. Okay, thank you very much. And from the challenge of the medical, the healthcare issue to the economic, the economy, the deficit, the need to reignite the economy as quickly as possible. Professor Eckstein, the director of the Oron Institute at the IDC. Well, the economic aspect is a significant one. And Amos has already said that right now, every month, if we continue with this form of lockdown. Can everybody hear me? Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So at the current level of lockdown, we are losing between 40 to 50 billion shekels. That's between 3 to 4% of the GDP. It's an unprecedented damage, and you can see it all over the world. The government has taken several measures that enable us to live, but continuing to operate at this level will lead to the economic collapse of this country. So the ultimate goal should be for medicine to serve a clear strategy of going back to work and increasing Israel's GDP. But we need to think about it through two prisms. And I heard about the problem of the medical data, but we also have some issues with the economic data. Let me explain how we need to work. We need to work through two prisms, not necessarily age, but the main one should be areas, regions, and sectors. And so regions or geographies and sectors, we need to make sure that there isn't an infectious system there, and we will give priority to essential areas or services that are working even today, and then we need to prioritize the sectors with high productivity levels. We can set very clear goals, very clear employment goals, and we can define it according to the ages that match these sectors, whether it's freelancers, people who are self-employed, or people who are salaried employees. And the medical world should make sure that the population groups that belong to these areas, to these geographies, and to these sectors can work at maximum capacity, either from home, remote work, but mainly to go to the workplace wherever that's necessary. Well, could you maybe tell us which sectors you're referring to specify? First of all, we have the essential sectors. Let's make it simple. If we're talking about medical services, security services, food manufacturing, food delivery, distribution, we need the system to continue to operate and for people not to be infected. Can that happen? And then we can talk about activities located in the north of Israel, the south, or the center of the country. And there are certain sectors there with higher revenues. High-tech, for example. Most of the people in high-tech are working, but maybe if there are certain places where they don't work, we need to give them the conditions to enable them to work so they won't infect each other. Maybe there are specific groups in specific places that it will be age-based, like what Professor Shashua said. We need to make sure that the employees in these places will be safe from being infected. We need to set a clear goal in numbers that will provide incentives to encourage employment in these places, and wherever we can expand employment and activity, whether it's additional retail activity, additional industrial or service-based activities, because wherever we enable that will contribute to the rise in the GDP. We cannot continue the way things are now. This is why the medical system doesn't need to work equally across the board all over the country. It needs to work based on two things: geographies and sectors, and maybe also with paying attention to age. I think that a sector in which all restrictions have been lifted, then people should go back to work, shouldn't remain on leave without pay. We need to provide incentives to the employers and the employees. I think that it is very important for the government to prepare for such a process that will start at the beginning of May at least. And we need in the public sector to reach their contribution to the effort. And we must bear in mind that right now we're in a situation that you said that 1 million people have, signed up to receive unemployment pay, but we have a lot of people receiving their salaries in the public sector who are only working part-time, and we need to enable them to go back to full-time work in a gradual manner. And I think we need to establish a process that the the knowledge in the medical world coalesces with the desire to increase the GDP in the ways I mentioned. Thank you very much. Yossi Kuchik, who was the Director General of the Prime Minister's office and was the person in charge of salaries in the Treasury, he was supposed to be with us, but he couldn't be here. But a few days ago, we held here in the INSS war game simulation as part of this process of formulating the INSS strategy, and we will hear what he had to say. He was the finance minister in the simulation. Let's see what he said as the finance minister in the simulation. Let's integrate that into our discussion. Well, look, as the Minister of Finance, let me tell you what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with 1 million people who are unemployed, and let me remind you that these are not untrained, unskilled, uneducated people who are unemployed, people who are the best of the best and maybe won't have what to eat tomorrow. Tens of thousands of small businesses that have collapsed, maybe more than that, maybe hundreds of thousands. The civil service, the public sector that is pretty much paralyzed, a significant, severe drop in tax collection. Let me remind you that we had a growth of 3.2%. Now there's negative growth, a huge deficit, debt to GDP ratio that's close to 80%. It's as if, a work of 20 years is going down the drain, a financial system that we must maintain its stability. There's tremendous damage to the business sector, to the financial markets. Large corporations will collapse, and we've already given the healthcare system an additional 10 to 15 billion shekels. In order to deal with the challenge, I need to strengthen the welfare system. Since this is the INSS, maybe we'll also have to cut back on the security budget, on the defense budget. And I'd also like to say that we still haven't thought about how to respond to the aviation world, tourism, music, concerts, performances, etc. We are facing a catastrophe. We have terrible chain reactions. The Economist earlier talked about a loss of 40 billion shekels a month. I think it'll even be more than that. There are hardly any revenues, and that means people can't pay their rent, can't pay their mortgages, debts, vendors, bonds. It's terrible. It's a very severe slippery slope. Now, perhaps if the lockdown continues, we won't have only 1 million people who are unemployed. We'll have 1.5 million people are unemployed. We have 2.9 people who are employed in Israel. And when we think about the small businesses, and people simply don't have what to eat. They can't afford to buy food right now. Let me say the following. Sir, Minister of Welfare, could you comment on what the Minister of Finance said? Well, the Minister of Welfare is actually a woman. Could you comment? Well, it'll happen. 1 million people who are unemployed and hundreds of thousands of small businesses will have to make ends meet with 6,000 shekels a month. That's the reality. We must understand that. We cannot escape that. It's not just, talk. Think about any of you. What would happen if this were to happen to any of you? Let me say the following. There are several conditions that need to exist, I think, that are starting to happen. First of all, we need to flatten the curve and stop the disease. I said that 15 billion shekels have been allocated to the healthcare system, especially to make sure that we have enough beds in the ICU. That's the bottleneck. We don't want people, to suffocate to death in the hallways of hospitals like we saw in Spain, in Italy. Perhaps we'll see that in the U.S. Please, Mr. Prime Minister, you have experience. We need a real-time intel picture of the situation. We had 2 or 3 months to prepare for that. So please, sir, you need to instruct the relevant people, and we have enough forces for that in Israel. We need to have 10,000 ventilators, and we need to improve the intel picture. And if I add to that an effective testing system, then maybe our routine will be an effective and focused detection of stats that will enable a dynamic and differential policy, easing policy. Well, I think that The Israeli economy needs to start operating again in a rapid, gradual manner. In the 2 months after Passover, I'd like many people to go back to work, many of these small businesses to go back to work immediately, commerce, services, industry, and high-tech. Why should the people in high-tech and not be able to work? And we also need to resume studies and, the school system, kindergartens, we need to prepare for remote learning. And Mr. Prime Minister, you should consider canceling the summer vacation so we can go back to learning over the summer. Don't you remember your negotiations with the Teachers Association, with the Teachers Union? Look, this is a case of emergency, and, it's no laughing matter. It's worse than any of the wars Israel has ever experienced. Let me remind you that we have a public sector, a civil service that hasn't paid a dime to participate in this warm effort. You need to do that as well. You need to ask the Ministry of Finance to address that, wages, pensions. I'm not talking about laying people off. I'd like to use this crisis and because there are many opportunities here for structural changes that can accelerate growth. We must quickly reach. It's a matter of emergency. Doesn't matter if we have a government or not. We need to decide on a budget so that we can start doing this. This is how things are. This is what I'm suggesting, sir, Mr. Prime Minister. We cannot wait anymore. We cannot play it safe. If we have the safety net that enables people who are severe patients to be treated properly and allocating budgets to the healthcare system, and I'd really like to commend the nurses, the doctors, and all other healthcare employees, we must ease things up. So we've heard about the more healthcare-focused alternative, the alternative that focuses on the economy, and now we'll talk about the alternative that focuses on society. To you, Brigadier General in Reserves Meir Elran from the INSS. Maybe you could say a few words about the social aspects of this crisis with a certain projection for the upcoming period. Meir, please. Well, I'm talking here on behalf of a group that we have gathered to discuss this. I'd like to mention the names Dr. Moran Hodes from the Gertner Institute, Professor Koczynski from the IDC, Professor Shachar Eyal from the IDC, Professor Yuval Frankel from Bar Ilan University and the Israel Democracy Institute, and Dr. Karmit Padan from the INSS. And now, first of all, regarding the characteristics of the social situation, the way we see it as of today, all in all, public conduct is characterized by reasonable discipline, and it's constantly improving. We've seen improvements both in the Jewish ultra-Orthodox sector and in the Arab sector. 3/4 of people say that the lockdown policy is the right policy. Only 3% of the people have answered that they just leave home whenever they feel like it. Another issue, there's a significant fear of the disease. 75% of the population are afraid of it, and that's similar in scope to the fear from the economic implications, both on the personal and national levels. 75% fear that as well. But people still have a certain self-efficacy perception that's pretty high. 2/3 of all people who were questioned said that they and their families can deal with the virus to a great extent. And we also measured, or national resilience was gauged from a personal perspective in the corona era. And the values are pretty high. I can say that from the studies, the polls that we have today, the confidence level, the trust level in the government is 50%. Of course, it's insufficient, it's not enough, but it's highly compatible with the thinking patterns or people's political views. We need to understand what that means, but we are definitely facing a trust issue, and that's also related to the issue of educating and informing the public. I'll talk about that later. There's another issue, the stark distinction between the different population groups. We've just seen what happened with the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I'd like to say regarding the Arab population, they're 20% of this country. We actually have no clue the number of people who are sick. The numbers we know about aren't necessarily representative. And we should also bear in mind the different vulnerable, underprivileged populations in Israel. At this backdrop, we enter the projection. Of course, our projection truly depends on the development and evolution of the pandemic, especially if we look at it from the prism of the severe cases. We assume that any drop in the morbidity level will make people less alert, less vigilant. If things improve a bit, that people will start thinking that everything's fine, and that brings us to a risk of a slippery slope. I'll soon talk about that. On the other hand, there's a certain paradox that if the existing curve continues to go up, if the lockdown continues over time and becomes perhaps even stricter, that can create some very difficult phenomena, especially the difficulty in managing a household and managing the Israeli society under this situation. And I can tell you that we're already seeing initial buds and really fear, not from the discipline being eased up, but perhaps phenomena of, people violating public order, what we saw in Jaffa yesterday, for example, and what we've seen in other places in the world, especially amongst the underprivileged populations. We've seen that in India, and now we're starting to see that in New York. The lockdown itself makes it more difficult for people. So it's very difficult to talk about the entire population. You need to think about the separate groups. So this is what we thought about together in that simulation that Itai just mentioned. Now I'd like to say a few things about the policy we recommend. And this policy is based on that group that I mentioned earlier that got together to think about the social aspects. A few points of emphasis. First of all, the current shutdown policy is creating significant difficulties for the economy, for society. To continue this strict lockdown over time will lead to psychological fatigue. The general population, it will be too difficult for them to live like that. And sooner or later, certain portions of the population will rebel against the instructions, the lockdown instructions. Let me say something about the using scare methods to increase discipline. And it seems effective in the short term. It's working for now. But we know from studies conducted elsewhere and in Israel that in the long run, this approach is not efficient. Like I said earlier, tightening the lockdown will make it very difficult for everyone, and especially for the underprivileged populations. Let me just say one more thing. We need to finish. Okay, so let me just talk about informing and communicating with the public. It's a critical aspect. I think that Shlomo Segev talked about it as well. The issue of educating the public, that's a critical issue. What we have now is explaining everything to everyone in the same way, but we need to differentiate the explanations. The more differentiation we have, there is no one group. We don't have one common denominator. We need to differentiate. That makes it very complicated, and we cannot assume that one person can manage all of that, as gifted as that person is. And that takes me to the issue of trust. Public trust is critical. Right now, it is insufficient, and we need to see how we can create tools that are completely based on trust. I can talk about the other issues later if Itai gives me more time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Meir. Now we move on from the social aspects to the legal aspects. Colonel in Reserves, Pnina Sharvit Baruch from the INSS. Could you give us, the legal perspective regarding these ideas that have come up here? Yes, hi everyone. Just let me comment briefly. First of all, the current use of different means, for monitoring, tracking civilians, including using the capabilities of the ISA and the police. And I understand, the importance of these measures and how beneficial they are, but we must remember that if you give this power to the government over time, it's very dangerous. We need to have constant control regarding the significant advantage they provide and to compare that to the damage. We cannot simply get used to them and leave them in place over time. That's part of the definition somebody mentioned at the beginning, the fact that we need to preserve our regime and Israel's regime structure. The second point regarding the different alternatives of letting people out of quarantine, we need to pay attention to discrimination or lack of discrimination, because if we open up the economy in a gradual manner, we need to see what the parameter is. As long as we're distinguishing between essential workers and others, that's simple. But if we allow certain businesses to open up or other businesses that are similar or even identical but maybe in a different location, then people can argue that this is discrimination. You need to devote a lot of thought, and we need to come up with a plan that takes into account the relevant considerations. Maybe in certain places, maybe we can think about opening up shopping malls gradually, but only some of the shops. And do we leave it up to the manager of that shopping mall to decide, or is that decided in advance? These things will have to be very clearly thought out. Another point that comes up, to what extent and if to intervene. Should the government intervene into matters that are part of the private sector? Should they intervene in what is considered a force majeure event or not? Is this a force majeure event? Whether to intervene in leases, in rent leases, delivery dates, extending delivery dates? Should that be a government policy, or should we leave it up to the market forces? Another point is the response to the other risk factors, not to neglect all other groups, other people who are patient, the people who are disabled, domestic violence, that has increased significantly, and we need to devote some thought to that. Another point, if the decision is that people with pre-existing conditions and the elderly will have to stay in quarantine, to be sheltered in place, maybe they will say, you know what, you're trying to protect me, but let me decide for myself. Let me out and I can sign a waiver on a ventilator. I don't want you to force me to stay at home. We need to think about it from an ethical, medical perspective. What should we do with that? Because maybe certain people prefer to take the risk and not to remain isolated. And another issue is, ageism and age-based discrimination, because the employers will say, even if I'm re-employing those who are sent on leave without pay, then the people who are older remain at the end of the list, because they will be the last to come out, or maybe when they do come out, they'll soon become ill. So we need to think about that. Two additional points is the issue of the Palestinians and, of course, specifically East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, the Israeli law applies there, so we need to give a better response to the people living there than what we currently have, and the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, that we have certain responsibility over them, and Gaza, that's a very complicated issue, and I know that you'll devote a separate simulation to that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pnina. Now let's move on to Brigadier General in Reserves Israel Aharon, former deputy of the NSC. If you could give your general perspective and your recommendations for the right strategy, Israela. Is this okay now? Is it working? Hi, everyone. Well, some of the things I wanted to talk about have already been mentioned, but I would like to emphasize a few. First of all, the issue of communicating with the people to really provide answers and the relevant information to the population in a way that will enable people to truly understand what's being said to them. I believe with Meir that this is a very challenging task, but it's not impossible. It's definitely feasible. And it turns out out that the information doesn't reach the Arab population, the ultra-Orthodox population, in the way that it should reach them, in a way that would enable them to process and understand this information. And this is something we need to start working on, as of yesterday. And of course, that impacts the behavior of the population. And now I have a question for Professor Shashua. The parameters of population behavior, was that included in your research calculations? And if so, in what way? Because I think that this is an extremely important parameter. And another point has to do with the differentiation within the population. Of course, there's an overlap between old age and pre-existing conditions, underlying health conditions, but it's not the same thing. As somebody who represents that age group, I'm 67 years old, I'd like to say that people are at an age that is considered old, but still they do not pose a risk to the population. They are not at risk of infecting others. So we need to make a more surgical differentiation than merely talking about the elderly and pre-existing conditions. We need to make a much more precise distinction. Another point I wanted to bring up has to do with the school system, because the school system is a significant bottleneck in getting the economy back into action. And for people going back to work, we need to think about different solutions. And I am stealing the economic solution mentioned by Udi, to work, for example, for 4 days and then stay at home for 10 days. Maybe the school system initially needs to switch to such a teaching method, and the school system can also help those who advocate herd immunity. My two last points. Actually, one last point. If we're talking about our relationship with the Arab sector in Israel and our relationship with the Palestinians, I think that we have a genuine opportunity here, in this entire coronavirus business. This can actually be a lever to improve our relationship both with the people of Gaza, the people in the West Bank, and of course with our very own people, the Israeli Arabs. So good luck to all of us. There are a few questions that people have written to us. Professor Gili Regev-Yochay, there was a question about the tests. The question is, I've heard that as of next week, the HMOs will be responsible for the tests. Are they capable of doing that? Are you with us, Professor Yochay? Yes. Can you hear me now? Yes. Once again, I don't know which labs. I can tell you about the Maccabi HMO lab. I know it personally. It's an excellent lab, and I'm certain that whoever is responsible for that, I have no doubt that there are enough labs, enough of excellent lab technicians in Israel. That's not my concern. My concern isn't about who will do it, but will we have the substances to do it with? And two economic questions. Professor Eckstein, are you with us? Yes. The first question, should the State of Israel consider massive vocational retraining for all those people who have been fired and who are on leave without pay? The second question, whether the decision to reduce payment 10 to 15% from all civil servants who earn over 35 to 40,000 shekels a month, maybe that could save a lot of money and won't really damage the economy. Should that be adopted? Well, first of all, the first measure is something that we recommend in the paper that we've written. And let me tell you, I headed a committee that recommended a very significant reform in vocational retraining, especially for people who are unemployed and people who are entering the workforce. And I think that the Treasury agrees with me in this return process to the labor market. Vocational training or retraining, we're talking about 400 to 600 hours of training, especially those areas where people can learn through Zoom. And the digital digital areas that will be in greater demand in the near future. That's very important. And I know that they're starting to prepare for that in the government, and we need to budget this measure. And I think it will be budgeted soon as part of the plan how to leave the shutdown. And as for the other issues, we need to reach an understanding with the civil servants. You know, the entire private sector, their salaries are being cut, and you know, even in high tech, people's salaries are being cut because a significant element of that's part of this crisis, as that will be a decrease in the demand both in Israel and abroad. And I think the civil service, the public sector, should also be a part of that. You know, because salaries in the business sector have gone down, and you know, across the entire public sector, salaries should also equally be cut. We have a few minutes left. So, Brigadier General in Reserves, Meir Elran, you asked to add a few comments, so you can do so now. I'd like to say something that's a bit optimistic. I work a lot on existential resilience and social resilience. What we're experiencing here is, of course, a crisis, a first-rate crisis, but there are mechanisms, there are very clear theories that tell us how this should be managed, not in order to just create functional contiguity, but also in order to encourage rapid recovery, not just to rebound to the previous state, but to an even better future situation. It's possible, and Israel has proven time and again in the crisis it has gone through that it knew how to manage these crises in such a way that there was rapid recovery after them. So we need to learn from our own experience and to adopt things and patterns that we've done in the past. And as a result of this line of thinking, of this direction, we need to establish the correct mechanisms in order to try and make the best out of it. And it's up to us. Thank you. Thank you very much. Amos, maybe just a few concluding comments, and if you could present the INSS's recommendations for the right Israeli strategy. Well, national leadership and the various teams of the national leadership need to show us where we need to go. Professor Shashua invented this thing called Waze, and I think that right now Israel's Waze is stuck at a dead end. It's not even a dead end. We're heading towards an accident, a collision, a severe one. And the INSS Waze tells us that we want to go to a place in which Israel can rebound and can continue to function with the coronavirus, because it's not going to go away. It's here to stay, even with herd immunity. It can come in a second or third wave. It can come over the winter. The second wave of the Spanish flu killed more people, more tens of millions of people than it did in the first wave. But today we're much smarter. We're much more experienced. They're constantly scaring us with Italy and Great Britain, but there are other countries. We've studied them: Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Sweden, that did not paralyze the country in order to stop the disease. And we think that we need to switch to a different strategy. According to this strategy, we are working on a differential plan. We need to differentiate based on geography, on sectors, contribution to the economy based on mapping the vaccination, the immunity, and based on the fact that it's completely clear that there's a highly vulnerable population and we truly need to protect that population. And there's another population group that can resume their work. And all that depends on very good intel. Let me tell you, as former head of the Intel Directorate, you cannot go to war without intel. We need to collect intel, we need to analyze intel, and we need to design a thinking model to see where the future is going. We believe that the current decision, that the current plan is a very severe one. They scared us that it's exponential, but it's barely linear today. It's even less than linear. And the safety margin that was chosen doesn't justify what we're seeing in the economy. I'd like to see the graph that we've developed, and we would like the cabinet to see this every evening when they think about it. At the top, you see the health problem. Look at the huge difference between the capability of the healthcare system, that based on the lower estimates, it's 1,500, and based on the higher estimates, it's 3,000. And today, all we have is 100. So there's a vast range. Yes, it's a bit lagging behind, we know, but still we can use this graph in order to ensure that we won't reach the highest capacity of the healthcare system. And thanks to all the measures that are taking, we're also raising the bar of the healthcare system's capacity. And after Passover, we'll even be in a better situation that we are in today. And today, we're already doing much better than we did in February. But on the other hand, nobody's looking at the y-axis. Look at it. If you could lift it up. Look at the drop in the GDP. Look what's happening in our economy. We're on the red line, and that red line is trying to flatten upwardly the amount of people who are sick, but it doesn't tell us until when. And we're hemorrhaging money every month. 4%, 8%, 12% of GDP, and that can also become exponential, because when businesses and companies go bankrupt, then it'll increase exponentially. Therefore, a reasonable, responsible leadership needs to look at both of these graphs simultaneously. And what we're suggesting is the blue graph. And based on what Professor Shashua said, it'll be beneath the red line. But let's take a bit worse scenario, that it'll be a bit above the red line, and still the economy will be able to recover, and to do so quickly. Intel is essential. Like I said, if we don't do the tests, and it's not completely clear to us how come this isn't transferred from the responsibility of the Ministry of Health to national management, the Weizmann Institute, the IDF. We have very powerful organizations, both scientifically and operationally, because, you know, the Prime Minister decides on 10,000 tests, 20,000 tests, but the system that is beneath him doesn't know how to carry it out. And if we have a much better mapping, we can send people to return to their work in different geographic areas. The situation, you know, Eilat and Mitzpe Ramon is very different than Bnei Brak, and we need to start to open up the economy according to a certain order. And the order should be what the sectors contribute to the GDP, or how many people, that's easier to measure, how many people go back to work, are once again employed, and reinvigorate our economy. We came up with this plan with the help of a lot of people. I mean, I could stay here for the rest of the night if I were to name all the people who have helped us, and all the doctors, along with the Oron Institute that talked about the economic aspect, led by Brigadier General in Reserve Sasson Haddad here in the INSS. We suggest that we resume economic activity in the presence of the coronavirus. I said that we need to collect intel, and I said that the best place to conduct a pilot like the one that Professor Shashua is requesting, but this model could also serve other models. This pilot needs to be done within the IDF, within the military, because it'll know how to do this quickly. We need to continue and raise the bar of the hospital's capacity. We are full of admiration, full of awe to all the physicians and all the people who are working in healthcare professions. We don't have an inkling of criticism towards them, just endless admiration and appreciation for the wonderful work that they're doing. But that's merely one angle of this war. We must measure the increase in the GDP as a key theme after Passover so that we can let people go back to their work. We need to set employment goals, and we need to do that based on how necessary the sector is, high tech and industry first and foremost, and whatever comes at the end. People were like places like soccer games and clubs and bars and cafes and restaurants, but wherever the risk is low, we need to behave differently, and that needs to be explained very well. And in our plan, there was a recommendation to transfer this public education effort from the person who's leading this, who needs to focus on strategy, to people who know how to communicate, people that half of this nation, at least the second half of this nation, believes. That's very important. People in Israel are intelligent, and once it's explained to them how they need to behave, just like in Singapore and Taiwan, wearing masks, maintaining a distance, that does not contradict going back to work. There was no sense in reducing the number of people who are allowed to work from 30% to 15%. It only harmed the GDP even more. We need to increase it back to 50%, 60, 70% based on sectors. I think that we're not England when it comes to herd immunity. The initial measures taken were the correct measures. Unlike the situation in England, they didn't protect the elderly properly. They said herd immunity for everyone, but we have a very good plan. And according to the current plan of the Ministry of Health, we'll never reach herd immunity. We need to combine between protecting those who are at a high-risk group and those who are young. And the chances that they'll go to the hospital and need life support, the chances for that are very low. These people need to go back to work, and they will create herd immunity. And this is the last item on our plan. We think that this campaign cannot be completely managed, under the cooperation of one director general of a ministry and the prime minister. We need to have an entire team working on a discussion. We suggest that there will be a cabinet committee for the war on corona. 7 ministers headed by the prime minister and the acting prime minister, the minister of health, of finance, of welfare, homeland security, education, and law. That's it. It won't be broadcast anywhere. It won't be leaked. And they need to hold a discussion after proper preparation work, serious preparation work will have been done. A team of experts, of director generals of all the ministries, headed by a very experienced and appreciated, credible public figure, somebody who knows how to manage strategy, somebody who knows how to manage large systems, and they will prepare these discussions, keeping an eye at both graphs and thinking about the differentiation and distinction that needs to be made between geographies, between people, and between sectors. The defense system, the security establishment, Israel is the strongest establishment in Israel. They have a budget of many, many billions. We send our sons and daughters there, our best people, to protect us from a threat. This is not a threat that the security establishment is supposed to deal with, but it'll deal with it in the best possible way. The fact that the security establishment is working, it is involved, but it hasn't taking its amazing capabilities in strategic planning and even more so in execution. Not all loops come close today. And, this security establishment knows how to plan, knows how to operate, and knows how to make sure that it indeed happened. I just heard that Division 98 is entering the town of Bnei Brak, so I guess they're beginning to understand who really knows to act well at the end of the day. I'd like to recap. We recommend that our outline will be adopted after Passover. Professor Shashua just added another element that was missing in our plan, in our outline, and it's very positive because what he's saying that there is no trade-off between the health and the economy. Both both parameters can be improved through a certain course of action. We will submit this model. It's already on its way to our national leadership, and we truly hope that it'll serve as a compass, as a ways that will take us to our proper destination. Thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you very much. Amos, let me remind you that on this coming Monday at 1 p.m. we will hold yet another conference in our series, this time the implications of corona on our regional system, the Middle East. Goodbye, everyone, and have a healthy weekend.